Hello and welcome to the launch of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, Global ABC, webinar series, Future-Proof Buildings. Thank you for joining us as this webinar series explores how to achieve a buildings and construction sector that is zero emission, efficient, and resilient. Before we get into today's program, let me introduce Natasha, who is our coordinator of the Global ABC, and she'll give you a short overview of the Global ABC and the series.
Good morning. I welcome all our listeners to this first webinar of a series which will respectively explore various topics over time, which will always be in relation to our Global ABC 5 work areas. But before we start the webinar, let me give you a short reminder of what the Global Alliance for Building and Construction is. It was founded at COP21 and is hosted by the United Nations Environmental Programme. It's an international initiative which focuses on both raising ambitions to meet the Paris climate goals and mobilizing all actors along the value chain. We have about 120 members, which includes 27 countries, and this makes the Global ABC the leading global platform connecting governments, private sectors, and organizations to drive the transformation towards a world where all buildings, old and new, are zero emission, efficient, and resilient. So we accomplished this vision through the work of 5 global ABC work areas, and one of which, market transformation, is the focus today of the first webinar on science-based targets. Each organization presenting works with the Global ABC on breaking barriers to open the markets for buildings. You may have come across our flagship products, so the Global Status Report, which keeps track on yearly development in the sector. Let me also highlight that we have developed a global roadmap, which is now being expanded into regional roadmaps, which identify key steps to put the sector on a sustainable path. And also our regional roundtables foster matchmaking and best practices exchange, such as the upcoming regional roundtable in sub-Saharan Africa on 28th of May. So if you are planning on coming on the UN Habitat Assembly later this month, please let us know. This is the first series of webinars in which we hope to forge a community, increase peer-to-peer exchange, and build a body of knowledge around the sustainable transition of the building and construction sector towards the ultimate goal of reaching the Paris Agreement targets. I want to thank our members for having agreed to give presentations today, and I leave you now with Harper, our communication officer, who will also be moderating this session.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you for highlighting that we're having a regional roundtable during the UN Habitat Assembly at the end of May. We're looking forward to it. So the webinar today focuses on the role of the private sector in aligning ambition and action towards reaching Paris Agreement targets. This theme led us to explore science-based targets and invite speakers who work to raise ambition and coordinate action directly with future-looking companies. More than 550 companies with trillions of dollars in revenue, including several property, construction, cement, and steel firms, have now joined the Science Based Targets Initiative, aligning their emission reductions with the Paris Agreement. And before we hear from our speakers, I'd just like to remind us of a few key buildings facts that frame the discussion. In 2017, buildings and construction was nearly 40% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. In a city like New York, buildings are responsible for 70% of the city's GHG emissions. And construction isn't stopping anytime soon. We build a Paris and floor space every week, meaning current global floor space will double in 2060. To be on the path to 1.5 degrees, we must increase energy efficiency in our buildings. Yet very few countries have strong enforced building codes or specific policy actions on buildings. The key decision makers in government and business must recognize the urgency to act in this sector and the significance of buildings for accomplishing Paris climate goals. Today, we'll be hearing from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, ADEME, the French Agency for Environment and Energy, LafargeHolcim, and the World Green Building Council on different interventions for developing science-based targets for the building sector. From international commitment and coordination to working directly with companies to identify hotspots for intervention and implementing low-carbon pathways, our speakers are leaders on the front lines helping to accomplish a world where we live in zero-emission buildings. We'll start the webinar with an introduction from LafargeHolcim, one of the companies and many actors we work with on market transformation. And he's joined by the co-chair of the work area, Luca, the manager of science-based targets from WBCSD. And please pause with me as I transfer the presentation over to Luca.
So, Harper, am I on? Do you want me to continue, or because I heard a different name?
No, yes, you are welcome to continue, Michael, and I am leading to your presentation now.
Okay, thanks, Harper, and welcome everyone. My name is Michael Scharpf from LafargeHolcim. We are a cement manufacturing, concrete manufacturing construction solution company with a global footprint. And so my role here is to elaborate on why a company which has a strong say, or also a lot of targets on carbon emissions as such, is engaging in an integrated exercise, which we are seeing here with the working group on market transformation within the Global Alliance. So the purpose is to engage with businesses and stakeholders to decarbonize the entire building and construction value chain. I will elaborate a bit on what we are understanding under this. Then I would switch to the last point, because it is on science-based targets for to my opinion, not only for low CO2, it's also in general on circular economy. No, back please. Back please. Previous slide, Harper. Yeah, it's I meant the last point of the slide. It's on circular economy. It's on low CO2, but there are various topics around resources that we have to address, and CO2 is maybe just proxy of many of those topics, which we all have to see also in a connection to each other. And then I'm coming to the second bullet point of this slide. The big need is to engage and to elaborate across boundaries, across silos, and that is across different industries which are engaged and which are working and playing in this field of construction. But it's also very importantly to all kinds of policymakers on all levels, be it national, subnational, municipality levels. That is a key objective of a working group on market transformation. And Harper, if you go to the next slide, I will also share a couple of thoughts on how that could work out and what are some scenarios in this. So the hypothesis on low carbon construction is that we do not have a lack of solutions and knowledge how to get there. So we do know how to decarbonize materials. We also do know how to produce low carbon, zero carbon, even net negative carbon buildings. The knowledge is there. It's not a lack of technology. It's really a lack of how to roll this out into practice. It's also talking about innovation. Maybe it's not necessarily the high tech that we are looking for. Maybe it's the appropriate tech that also could play a role in finding a pathway towards zero carbon construction sector. If I translate, or if I bring in some figures from the material side, not directly from the carbon emission side. I'm coming from Germany. I'm now working in Switzerland. The material consumption of a per capita, so of an average citizen in Switzerland or Germany, is 4 times higher than the material consumption globally, global average. So maybe technology also needs to go into a direction to just avoid some technologies, or being very appropriate. So that's number one, no lack of knowledge about that. And then secondly, and that's why we're very keen to bring together various stakeholders across the value chain of construction and across the entire life cycle of buildings. That is, we need business frameworks. We do need market frameworks. We do need a common sense. We need a common sense that we that we have to follow this route towards zero carbon construction sector. Very often from our market practice, we make the experience that we do have products that go into the direction. We have solutions which can offer a low carbon or a carbon reduction, and we're very much struggling in rolling those out in certain markets. It's just that in many cases the barrier is that we are facing a lack of incentives, and so we have to make clear that sustainability, low carbon, means bringing some external cost into the picture, making those costs transparent and clear, and also making clear that this kind of sustainability and upgrading of solutions towards low carbon comes as a cost. We bring in external costs, and so we have to make those costs transparent, and we have to also make clear that bringing or introducing a low carbon construction will have a price, a monetary price. And for that, we need all players together on one table. That is the solution providers showing how it works, showing what kind of innovation we can follow, but it's also the municipalities, the regulators, other market players who also are working together on the playing field in which we have sufficient incentives to follow this route. And with that, I would like to hand over to Luca, I believe, giving you a bit more insights on what the science-based targets for buildings and constructions is then about in detail. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael, for your intervention and for discussing how important it is for us to move and have these frameworks to drive the transition. I've moved the presenter over to Luca. So now Luca can share his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think getting it right. Voila. Thanks, Michael, for setting the context of information work area. My name is Luca Giovanetti. I'm the manager for.
Can you see my screen?
The manager for science-based target at WBCSD. Maybe very briefly on the World Green Building Council for Sustainable Development, which is a global CEO-led organization of 200 forward-thinking companies working together to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world. In essence, our motto is we want sustainable business to be more successful. But back to the I think this key information that was mentioned at the beginning is that the building construction system emits 40% of global emissions. And as mentioned before as well, the surface of Paris is built every 5 days. I think these are two key figures that leads the work we are doing. And regarding the emissions, I think it's important also to remind that based on the global status report of the Global Alliance, currently 30% of emission comes from building materials, so considered embodied carbon of buildings, while 70% are direct emission during the usage of buildings, of which 50% are related to the electricity consumption. Science-based target. Science-based target specify how much and how quickly, according to science, a company is required to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to be in line with the Paris Agreement goal to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. So this is the science-based target are based on the concept of carbon budget. That's where the science is how much carbon are we, so to say, still allowed to emit before reaching the temperature increase that is considered acceptable. Therefore, in this case, a 1.5 temperature increase as a lower carbon budget allowed, then well below 2 degrees, which is also in line with the Paris Agreement, or a 2 degrees, which is currently seen as well as a limit to reach. I like also, especially in this context, I like to simplify maybe by saying that science-based targets are the private sector answer to decarbonization, and practically science-based target is for the private sector what the NDCs, the national determined contribution, are for the public sector. So it's really the what companies need to do, what role and responsibility do companies have to decarbonize. The initiative is the Science-Based Target Initiative, as formed by 4 organizations: CDP, UN Global Compact, World Resource Institute, and WWF. And the criteria for setting science-based target are, as described in the picture, is related to setting emission reduction on direct emission of companies, scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also there is other criteria that they are to be considered when setting science-based target. I think I'm skip to go into detail of the criteria, but obviously I would refer to this, to the Science-Based Target Initiative. The website is on the page if you need more information on details about the setting science-based targets. And scope 3 emissions, I think also being mentioned before as well, that what is the difference between scope 1 and scope 2 is that scope 1 are direct emission from companies, and scope 2 are indirect emission related to the energy consumption, electricity in general, while scope 3 are all related emission that they are linked to companies but are upstream emission, such as purchase of equipment, traveling, but also downstream emission like the use of sold products. And this comes obviously very relevant after in the discussion for the building and construction sector. Important on scope 3 emission is that, for example, for the property sector, scope 3 represent 80 to 90% of the overall emissions, because obviously there is the embodied carbon of building, but there is also the use of electricity during the usage of building. Another important thing is that scope 3 emissions are the scope 1 and 2 emission of another company. And that's why it's very important to work together along the value chain. That's why it was very important to work along the value chain, engaging on the value chain because of this interaction between different companies' emissions. For the project, what we want to achieve is to make sure that what we want to do as a project is to provide solution for companies to achieve their objective to set science-based target, to achieve their individual carbon reduction objective, but that these are also aligned with the needs and objective to decarbonize the system and the whole value chain. Is it fine that the audio? Yeah. So this is, yeah. So really just kind of to make sure that contribution from the initiative, the contribution from companies setting science-based target are really contributing to the overall decarbonization. An example for this is double glazing. I think this is an important example because it shows on how, if we want to decarbonize, if we want to reduce our the overall emission of the building sector, we need better insulation. We need better glazing, double or triple glazing. However, this requires more carbon intensity, and therefore there is more emission that companies, glass manufacturers, would have to provide in their product, and this was against their objective to individual decarbonization. But on the other side, it contributes to the sector decarbonization. So this is the dilemma. So we're looking across the value chain, building and construction. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, your sound's on. Yes.
I just hear some sounds. So let's say what we want to do along the value chain is to look on how carbon emissions are, where and how much emissions are happening along the value chain. So you have the embodied carbon, where materials, and the user side. So this is the flow of carbon emission, but as well important is the flow of the influencers and the flow of who has the responsibility or the power to change. So that's where we need to align these two lines to flow, and making sure that we're working on decarbonizing the value chain, working on decarbonizing the products, the company related to the value chain, but also working with the influencer to drive and to use their power to shift to generate the demand and awareness for more low carbon building sector. And then the importance of having a common language and a common framework is for to make sure that companies along the value chain, all stakeholders, can refer to a common language, allowing them to better compare their input, their effort, or their contribution in the building, in the system, but as well what is their overall decarbonization objectives. And so in this case, with this framework, we can see how companies can contribute to decarbonization or can contribute to carbon emission, but also overall where hotspot or effort can be done to reduce the carbon emission. So as the next steps in the projects, what we are looking now is to build on this whole building life carbon narrative, on the common language and framework, and ensuring that is leveraged across different effort done by partners in this space. Also working on system scenarios and trajectories on what is needed for building, what is needed for companies, what is needed for the system as a whole to decarbonize, to be in line with the decarbonization. The Paris is required, that the IPCC, the 1.5 is requiring. So really to make sure that we have a better understanding what efforts need to be taken, and having different scenarios that allow for different trajectories of decarbonization, but with the ultimate goal, obviously, to reach the same objective. And then the last is on working on a system guidance, where we provide a recommendation for all the sectors of the system, the macro sector of the system, on what is needed for this sector to consider when setting science-based target, but also very much the importance and the role and responsibility for their effort to decarbonize in the system. Just last on the project working group, we're obviously not working alone. We are working with, as part of the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, together to Women Business and the Science-Based Target Initiative, but with all different members of the private sector along the whole value chain, to really make sure that perspective and contribution from different members are included, but also that the different companies can provide their specific understanding, back to the fact that the scope 1 and 2 emission of a company is the scope 3 emission of another company. So we need to make sure that we work together across the value chain to achieve the whole system decarbonization that is very much needed. That's all from my side.
Thank you. Thank you, Luca, for that great presentation on SBT for buildings. And really, it's great to highlight what is needed for the sector to decarbonize, raising that ambition and connecting those stakeholders through defining that common language, and bringing attention to the conundrum of why we have to connect all those members in that value chain with the double glazing challenge. So absolutely, there's always trade-offs to carbon, to energy efficiency measures, and it's important to highlight what those trade-offs are and where those emissions might be changed in a different part in the supply chain. So that's really important to highlight. So we will then start with Edouard from ADEME, who I will share my screen with, and he can be the presenter now.
Okay, thanks, Harper, and hello, everybody. Can you see my screen? No, okay. So I'm Edouard Fourdrin, and thanks the Global Alliance for Building and Construction to for giving the opportunity to present ACT. So I work for ADEME, which is a French agency of environment and energy management.
Hello, Edouard.
Yes. Yes. Hello. Hello. Hello.
Hello, yeah.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Hello, Edward. You're okay.
And you are indeed there. Thank you.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, okay. Okay, sorry.
Hi,
And can you see
yeah,
my
go ahead.
Okay,
Sorry.
can you see my screen?
Yes, feel free to start your presentation when you'd like.
Okay, no, sorry. So I'm Edouard
Can you hear
Fourdrin.
me?
It's okay. Okay, so I will continue. I'm Edouard Fourdrin from ADEME, which is a French agency of energy management, and I work for the climate department, especially on ACT, which means assessing low carbon transition. So it's very complementary to the science-based targets initiative we just covered just before, and so I will continue with my presentation, but I'm not sure you're able to see my screen. Okay.
Yes, Edouard, we can see your screen. If you want to press play on your presentation in the upper left-hand corner, then your presentation will become the full screen.
Okay.
In the upper left-hand corner of the PowerPoint.
Okay, and yeah. Okay, so sorry for the point. So we wanted to in ADEME we wanted to during COP21 to equip companies with relevant methodologies and tools to face low carbon transition. And for us, the carbon footprint of the company were interesting. But not enough to tackle the low carbon transition. So we wanted to develop something which were based on science-based scoring on all relevant dimension and metrics, and that's why we wanted to develop ACT. Not alone, we worked with CDP. And ACT initiative for assessing low carbon transition is part of the Global Climate Action Agenda and supported by the French government. So ACT is an accountability framework and methodologies to assess how companies' strategy and actions are contributing to the Paris Agreement mitigation goals. How does it work? So as you can see, ACT is based on 5 questions. The first one is, what is the company planning to do? The second one is, how is the company planning to get there? Third one is, what is the company doing at present? 4 is, what has the company done in the recent past? And 5, how do all of those plans and actions fit together? So as you can see with these 5 questions, we want to address the past, the recent, the current, and the future GHG emission of the company. So we want to have a more dynamic and prospective vision of the climate performance of a company. And at the end, we have a score divided into 3 parts. The first one is a performance score between 0 and 20. Here it is 20 for an example. A narrative score between A and E, and a trend score between plus and minus. The performance score, between 0 and 20 is quite important and based on the assessment of the climate strategy of the company. And for that, we assess 9 indicators packages. The first one is very similar to science-based targets initiative. So we assess the targets of the company and we assess if the targets are compliant with low carbon pathway for the sector. Very similar to science-based targets initiative and very complementary to it. The added value of ACT is to go a little bit further in order to also assess the means the company wants to implement in order to achieve the goal. That's why we look at the material investment. So, for example, for an electricity producer, it's the investment in power plants for generating electricity. We look at R&D investment, immaterial investment. It's the investment in low carbon R&D. We look also at the product performance. It's very important for the construction sector, for example, to be sure that the new buildings are quite are efficient enough in order to be compliant with the low carbon transition for the sector, for example. And we look also in a qualitative way to some other aspects like management. So how does the company manage the climate transition inside its organization? So what is the transition plan? Is the climate strategy led by the head of the company, for example? We also look at strategy and action with supplier and clients in order to reduce the GHG emission. So how does the company work with the supply chain? We also look at the public engagement. For example, we look if the company is working on technical working group or something like that in order to improve the best practices of the sector. And the last one is a business model. We assess the business model the company is thinking about in order to be compliant in a low carbon economy. So thanks to these indicators packages, we obtain a score between 0 and 20, reflecting the level of compliance in terms of climate transition. The narrative score between A and E is more based on external data, and it's more a point of view of the assessor in order to be sure that everything is okay, everything is consistent, and there is no, for example, reputation of business risk for the company. So it's another part of the score, and the trend score is the evolution of the performance score when we do an assessment later. So in order to do an ACT assessment, like Luca said, we need some background scenario. And here you have an example of scenario pathway we developed for real estate and collective housing in Europe and France. And so this background scenario are for energy efficiency in buildings. And you can have the current performance of buildings in terms of kilogram CO2 per square meter and per year, and the objective for the sector in the 2050 in order to be compliant with the climate transition. And thanks to the background scenario, thanks to the low carbon scenario for the sector, if you look at the graph beside, we are able to draw and to elaborate, thanks to the SBT initiative, also the carbon pathway of the company. The company should follow in order to be compliant with the low carbon transition, and that's the blue line, the line in blue. And if you consider the real objective of the company in terms of GHG reduction, which is the gray line, you can observe, for example, in this example, there is a gap between the objective and the pathway the company should follow in order to be compliant with a low carbon scenario. You can also we consider also in purple, for example, here as the real GHG performance of the company, and we can also assess a gap between this point and the low carbon pathway the company should follow. So the gap analysis is one of main aspects we have in ACT assessment. It's not the only one. We have other aspects to consider, but it's just a kind of example of concept we use in order to assess the low carbon strategy of a company. So in the ACT assessment, we worked at international level and French level, with road test in order to experiment the methodology. The first one was at international level on some other sectors, not building. We worked on electricity producing, on car manufacturer and retail. And we started to work on the building sector thanks to the French road test last year with SMEs and mid-cap companies. We worked also on other sectors, but we started to work on building sector in order to have a first step of thinking and to be sure the ACT assessment is also doable for an SME or mid-cap company. And it was also a road test in order to be sure that we are able to use national low carbon pathway. For example, in France, we use the national low carbon strategy provided by the government. And so it was a way to experiment this kind of low carbon pathway and to be sure the company are on track or not. So the learnings we have from this road test in France for the building sectors is the following one. So we had companies with an average score of 7B plus with individual performance score between 4 and 12. And on the right side, you have the different performance of the companies per indicators I presented just before. So in terms of targets, material investment, product performance, etc. So you have the 9 modules you can find in the ACT assessment. The eight of the histogram is the score, and the width is the weighting of the module in the scoring. And in the building sector, for the French companies, we can observe that the product performance was quite good because we have 2 constructors, building constructors, which worked on efficient buildings. So the yellow part of the construction is quite good actually for those 2 companies. But we worked with SMEs and mid-cap, and for them, there were some weaknesses like the formalization of the transition plan, and the main difficulty was also to work with supplier because it was SMEs and mid-cap companies to work with supplier in order to engage with them and to reduce GHG emission of buildings. They made or they made it because we worked on construction sector and real estate. So that was the first iteration of ACT in terms of buildings, but it was a French exercise, so we wanted to develop a methodology for the building sector, for the whole building sector in terms of construction and real estate, and we developed thanks to a technical working group gathering experts, so companies, experts. CDP was also involved, of course, in the technical working group to develop the methodology for the construction sector and real estate at the international level in order to be able to propose ACT assessment for all companies, for all building companies which are interested in the assessment of the climate transition. The main challenges during this study was to define scenarios. That's why I'm really interested in SBT works on that, because the pathway for energy efficiency and building were quite difficult to develop due to the fact that we wanted the pathway at national and for the different types of building. So it's quite difficult to have a declination more specific pathway than we can have from the International Energy Agency. And for the construction material, which is other topic, the other issue of this sector, it was also difficult to elaborate low carbon pathways because we did not identify the pathway, and we proposed something based on the composition of building, the evolution of the composition, and the GHG footprint of the different construction materials. But it's a first step. So now the methodology is finished. You can see, you can study our methodology in our website, which is actproject.net. And the next step now is to experiment those methodologies starting from next month. So I hope we will we will be able to start the experimentation next month, so in June. And for that, we would like to recruit 5 companies who will benefit from free ACT assessment in order to experiment with us the methodologies and to provide feedbacks in order to improve the ACT methodologies for this sector. So if you are a company in the building sector and you are interested in low carbon transition and the assessment of your climate strategy, do not hesitate to contact me and to come on board for the ACT assessment. Just briefly to conclude my presentation, so we worked on, as I said, on construction and real estate, and we also work on other sectors for the ACT assessment, and some are linked with the building sector. So, for example, we will work on cement this year during the second part of this year, and we will also work a little bit later on metals and glass, and some other sectors which are important to address in terms of climate transition. And just to conclude, ACT is the assessment of the climate strategy of a company, as you understood, and so it occurs at the end of a GHG reduction strategy of a company, which begin with a GHG emission assessment, like for example an inventory of GHG emission for the company. After that, the company can work on an action plan in order to reduce GHG emission. The company can implement a strategy, and ACT is here to assess and to monitor the strategy in order to come back to the previous steps and to improve the previous steps and to be compliant with the low carbon economy at the end. That's the objective for the different sectors in terms of climate. And you can have some information on our website, which is, as I said, actproject.net.
Great, Edouard. Thank you so much for your presentation on ADEME and the Assessing Low Carbon Transition Pathway initiative. It's great to learn what the difficulties were in trying to assess those low carbon pathways of not having national frameworks. And so that's an interesting thing to note as we move forward with into this year and look to see what the climate commitments will be coming out of the UNSG summit and the COP at the end of this year. So we're going to go ahead and switch it over to Cristina, who will discuss some of those commitments and discuss the net zero carbon buildings commitment that World GBC coordinates across the globe. So changing over to Cristina.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Cristina Gamboa. I'm the CEO of the World Green Building Council, and I'm joined today by Victoria Burrows, the head of Advancing Net Zero Global Project, and we will be sharing with you today the World GBC's Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. This, just a brief thank you to the organizers. World GBC is a proud member of the Global ABC. We're members of its steering committee, and through the World Green Building Council, we have almost 70 green building councils around the world. And we represent collectively 37,000 companies that are taking climate action pretty seriously. For the global project funders, we want to thank We Mean Business and the Children's Investment Foundation, which have been enabling this work we are very proud to present today. And congratulations to our previous presenters with their progress and their frameworks. I think there's many things here that you will find will cut across initiatives, and maybe we can have some common ground for future collaboration. So this has been talked about a little bit, let's say, what's going on in terms of the climate movement. According to the IEA, the buildings sector is responsible for 39% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which are attributed to buildings. 28% of those come from the energy used to operate them, to heat, power, and cool. Since we spend around 90% of our time in buildings, we think it's very important to look after them so that they look after us. In September 2018, the World GBC launched the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment to recognize and inspire climate action towards net zero carbon buildings. In our definition, net zero carbon buildings are highly energy efficient to reduce energy wasted from buildings and are powered by renewable energy, either on-site or from off-site sources. We're interested in the way buildings actually perform and how they are optimized for energy performance and comfort. We know that net zero carbon buildings are achievable at individual building level. They can be found in every corner of the world and in every building type, from mosques in Amman and Jordan to affordable housing communities in Hawaii and high density multi-use precincts even in Sydney. Now, we believe it's time to achieve them at scale, portfolio, city, regional, and even national. And we're very hopeful that ambition will be scaled up in the upcoming climate talks. If we don't approach it in this way, we will not achieve the IPCC's emission reduction targets for the 1.5 degree scenario. So businesses have to commit their entire portfolio to operate at net zero carbon by 2030. Governments must commit to enacting regulation for new buildings to be net zero carbon by 2030, and all buildings, including existing, by 2050. They can also follow a pathway for their own municipal or government buildings to be net zero 2030. In the commitment, we set the target to achieve zero emissions as an outcome, but we allow the flexibility for organizations to develop bespoke roadmaps to reach their own goals. As you know, one size fits all, and we need everyone to be part of the solution. Finally, in addition to addressing their own portfolios, signatories to the commitment act as catalysts through core businesses activities for further action within the respective supply chains.
Hi everyone. So the commitment is open to all organisations that can demonstrate a high level of impact from their actions. And this includes global organisations who operate in many different countries and regions, or small companies that can bring about huge change through their advocacy activities. All parts of the supply chain can participate, including manufacturers, developers, designers, and investors, and all levels of government. We currently have 49 signatories, actually already updated, operating in over 70 countries and committing to eliminate over 300 million tons of carbon emissions from their buildings. That includes 20 businesses and organizations, including Salesforce and Majida for Time, who are a major developer in the Middle East, 23 cities, including Tokyo and New York, and 6 states and regions, including California and Scotland. We have a detailed guidance document which sets out eligibility criteria and requirements for the different stages of the commitment to ensure alignment with best practice approaches that can be applied anywhere. Businesses that sign up to the commitment also become members of EP 100 from the Climate Group as a new commitment pathway. We leverage our Global Green Building Council network that Cristina mentioned, who have a wealth of local experience and help deliver the requirements of the commitment. And this includes the use of green building certification schemes to verify progress towards achieving net zero goals. We have 9 new rating tools for net zero carbon buildings from the Green Building Councils of Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Canada, the US, Sweden, Germany, France, and India. And our GBCs roll out education programs. For example, in South Africa, you have the option to become a net zero accredited professional, and several green building councils run education series on net zero buildings. Recent research, such as the business case from the net zero carbon buildings from Canada Green Building Council, shows a positive return on investment over 25 years for net zero carbon buildings. And progress in several of our green building councils to refine what advancing net zero means for their markets, like a recent report launched by the UK Green Building Council for policy engagement and galvanizing market action. And finally, we facilitate knowledge exchange by publishing signatory profiles, such as the ones shown here, that set out how each organization intends to achieve their commitment. The commitment provides a framework for collaboration. Companies and cities that are signing up to the commitment are working together with our green building councils to help identify solutions towards the common goal and drive the mass scale market transformation we desperately need. This collaborative approach will be essential to assuring we achieve genuine emission reductions from the built environment. The IPCC report doesn't discriminate on who needs to take action, and neither do we. Collaboration is key, as there's no one solution to solve climate change. All buildings must decarbonize, and all organizations occupy buildings and have varying degrees of control over these spaces. So whether you own a significant amount of real estate and can make decisions about improving the performance of building systems, or you're procuring a new renewable energy contract, or you're a city that sets building regulations, everyone has some level of control to improve the way that our buildings perform. Some of our signatories, for example, are design firms. They occupy just a few office spaces around the world, but their greatest impact is in the designs and buildings they are creating and how they can advocate to their clients to ensure those buildings will be net zero. Our theory of change looks at how business, government, and NGO sectors must work together to achieve our goals. Businesses can create market signals by committing to net zero carbon emissions, and these signals inspire governments to take action. And that creates confidence and assurance to industry about upcoming regulations to support wider uptake. And the market will respond to create the conditions for success that we've listed here in order to achieve a decarbonized built environment. It's important that everyone plays their part. After an entity signs up to the commitment and their action plan is published on our website, the next stage is known as disclose. This is a really important step in any organization's approach to achieving net zero. In order to get to zero, you need to know where you're starting from, and you can't manage what you can't measure. So identifying any data gaps in understanding how your buildings are performing is a really crucial step in this process. And then that's the next stage, which is act. Now it's time to put the commitment into action, developing a bespoke roadmap for your unique situation and identifying measures to reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions. After that, we require annual reporting on progress in reducing energy demand and carbon emissions from buildings to inform future actions and show how the entity is advocating for wider emission reductions through their business. That fourth stage is verify, where organizations can prove that they are reaching net zero emissions by using different tools and methodologies available to them. This includes Green Building Council certification schemes that recognize buildings performing at net zero, or other carbon emission reporting methods used globally. We just ask that the data is third-party verified.
Thank you very much, Victoria. The commitment covers an organization's scope 1 and 2 energy-related emissions. That's the emissions associated with the use of energy by the building directly and the generation of energy supplied to the building as a common baseline. We have started our focus with scope 1 and 2 on emissions because we urgently need to address these, and we know how we can. Over time, we recognize the need to include wider emissions from other impact areas such as water and embodied emissions or upfront emissions associated with materials and construction. In fact, we are releasing a call to action report this September 2019 during Climate Week that looks at the actions needed from all areas of industry to reduce embodied emissions. We believe in order to achieve the outcomes we need to take a structured step-by-step approach to encourage organizations to tackle emissions that are currently well understood and where solutions exist. As awareness raises, we will update this program in accordance to market forces. For now, we are showcasing any action beyond the baseline through the commitment. For example, here's an action plan from Salesforce and how they're meeting their target through our advancing net zero commitment. It sets out what the company will do against each of those 5 stages of the commitment. In this case, Salesforce commit to all new buildings from 2020 and all buildings by 2030 to operate net zero carbon. So this is a case of company that is even putting their goals, the dates, before the ones we are suggesting. They are also committing to disclosing their scope 1 and 2 and also relevant scope 3 emissions via CDP. Actually, we've aligned our program with CDP. They have set out how they intend to achieve net zero through improving energy efficiency and procuring renewable energy, but they also intend to address embodied carbon. They will verify their progress using the certification schemes that we have listed here, and they will work with their suppliers to set their own science-based targets to achieve more emissions reductions through their supply chain. So here is a case of our commitment also crossing and across the board other initiatives like the science-based targets. You can find these for every signatory in our website, including the cities, states, and regions. And actually, we would like to make a final announcement. Do keep an eye on our campaigns. We are having this campaign called Building Life, launched in June, about the embodied carbon call to action report that I mentioned for September, that we're going to be also labeling World Green Building Week. So we strongly encourage you to be a part of this conversation. And with that, I'll hand it over to the organizers. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your presentation, Cristina. And we are pleased to hear from the CEO of World Green Building Council on how you are shaping the international community around greening buildings. And we're looking forward to your Building Life campaign and your embodied carbon report as well. We'll look forward to seeing those soon. So now we'd like to transition into a question and answer session for all of our presenters, and we'd like to again thank them so much for giving their time to really fill us in on what are science-based targets and how are they driving the transition to sustainable buildings. And so we will, I will be taking questions through the chat of the GoToMeeting, and so we have a great first question, and it is from O'Meal. And O'Meal asks, so towards embracing sustainable cities, how do developing countries in the global south strike a balance between transitioning to green buildings and carbon reduction and the very critical aspects of development and economic growth? So I think that's a really great question for Luca, if Luca would be able to answer that for us.
I wish I could answer easily this question. But yeah, let's say I think the important is obviously that for developing countries is to set on a path that already now that helps to decarbonize their efforts, but also that allows for the required development. So in this way, I think a green development, low carbon development is obviously very important to be set now to avoid that in future it needs to be addressed later. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously at the moment there is obviously no differentiation in effort that country needs to put at the international level. I think negotiations are still ongoing on how to take historic emission into account and how to allow for different paths and different regionalization of the emissions. But yeah, so it's not obviously an easy question or needs an easy answer.
No, indeed, not an easy question, but you definitely did give a very balanced answer. So our next question will be from Jamie. And Jamie asks, what do you suggest for local governments' awareness to achieve incentives? And what kind of support can be provided for local governments, and what kind of incentives could really get them to green buildings? And I will pose that to Cristina, if I might.
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. And also if Victoria can join me on this one. Basically, right now we're seeing, of course, we're all very hopeful that the climate talks will bring about increased ambition in the national determined contributions and all those things, but we know that cities also have a lot of influence. And I guess those are the most, let's say, low-hanging fruits in terms of incentives that can be rolled out. So with good transparency and information, cities could, let's say, do two things. Let's say give out incentives, for example, for increased floor space or density or tax rebates if you demonstrate your leadership in net zero carbon buildings, for example, or green buildings for starters. And also, I guess also starting the cities to green their own portfolios and getting them to perform at net zero carbon. That creates markets. That's how the green building movement started at the very upfront. You get an example, you get a first mover, you demonstrate it is possible, and then the market, with the correct market signals that this is coming, will change. And in particular, cities that are maybe rolling out performance-based codes and are gathering information through their master plans are doing some great work. And so through the 23 cities and in collaboration with C40, what we expect to do is to disseminate or cross-pollinate different cities that can do leadership in this space, so action is quicker. And we see this taking fold with data and transparency and feedback loops.
Great, thank you for that answer, Cristina. And indeed, it is important to have those market signals that can come from these incentives, and to make sure that we're having those building codes in place to provide an even playing field to really break that market open. So we have another question. I'll take 2 more questions. So this question is from Rebecca Cameron. And Rebecca asks, so the private sector is key to raising the ambition of NDCs in each country. How are these private sector science-based targets going to connect with each country's reporting on the NDCs and raising the ambition of the NDCs beyond 2020? And so I'm going to pose this question to ADEME, as they are the agency in France for energy and environment.
Thanks for this question. Yes, it's very interesting to link the commitments and the pathway of the private sector with the national NDCs. And so, for example, in France, our national NDC is based on the national low carbon strategy in France, proposed by the government. And for the different sectors, we have pathway for the main sectors, the main business sector. We have pathways we need to follow in order to achieve our NDC until 2050 for the transport, for the building, etc. And so inside the different sectors, thanks to initiatives like SBT Act or some other, we can now assess and the alignment of the company with the pathway. We can also assess the contribution of the company to those pathway. So yes, I think it's not easy, but we can link the private sector's commitment to the national NDC. But for that, we also need to have a full involvement of the different business sectors with all the companies inside the sectors in order to be sure with the NDCs are met. But like initiative we presented today, it's a first step to at least assess the contribution of a company to the decarbonization of the sector.
Great, Edouard. Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. And indeed, it is difficult to decarbonize the sector without having a full picture of all of the businesses that are in that sector, as buildings are such a unique thing in their long value chain and very fragmented, right? And so it's very important to have a full knowledge of that in order to achieve sustainable buildings.
But
okay, great. So we have
Sarah,
yes?
if I may also, that's exactly the same. It's a perfect question. It's exactly the same topic, which brings us to what we are doing in the Science-Based Targets for Construction Working Group, because we have a similar task to solve, just on a different level. How to bring together different targets that companies and sectors do have to a building, because there it again comes together, but only fractions. So we have to avoid overlaps. Overlaps also in or double account. We have to avoid double accounting. Our scope 1 and 2 as a manufacturer is someone else's scope 3. So exactly the same question: how can we bring in different targets into one consolidated target at the building level? And that's exactly what the Science-Based Targets for Construction Buildings Working Group at the Global Alliance is about.
That's great. That's great. And yes, indeed, this working group does advance the things that are absolutely necessary to move us forward on those Paris targets. And moving from that conversation, from discussing NDCs, we'd like to discuss what's coming out of the SG Climate Summit, as we're looking towards that at the end of the year. So we had one more question for Cristina, if she might entertain us. So what targets do you hope will be set at the SG Summit, and will those targets be science-based?
Well, you put me in a spot where I have to look at the stars and a little bit of guessing. But I guess we've all been connecting to the possibility of having summitable, as it's been spoken, announcements or high ambition. So I know we have been collaborating across several organizations, particularly climate action leaders that are willing to work in one united voice as ambassadors to have that, let's say, increased ambition. I guess since NDCs are national, right, we have to get states to or countries to a point where they increase their current ambition, and that's not very easy to do. And I guess there is one probably summitable announcement that of working with several countries. So by December we get those. But it's still not in a sweet spot. We're going to have scale of action. That's why all these initiatives that really engage and bring action quicker and not wait for those negotiations. For me, it's responding to what people need right now, and it's yeah, action quickly, not waiting for people to speak at the Climate Action Summit.
Absolutely. No, that couldn't be more right. And underlining the urgency to act in the sector is very important. And that's the whole purpose of this webinar series. And so thank you all so much for joining us today on this webinar series. And we would like to thank all of our speakers again for sharing their expertise and sharing their programs, and for acting in the buildings and construction sector. I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will answer your Q&A that you have left in the chat. We'll answer that by email, or also on our website. We'll leave a list of the Q&A, and we will upload the recording to our YouTube channel. So look out for that. And thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.